Welcome to our first hybrid program ever and our first in-person event in 19 months. It is really good to have everybody here. This is program 5 of 8 of our Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S.-China program series. Our final event of this series will be our Future of U.S.-China Conference, 4th annual, held right here on January 13th, so save the date. Today's event is on the future of technology, energy generation, and storage. Our special guest speakers today, K.R. Sridhar, founder, chairman, and CEO of Bloom Energy, Sean Simpson, chief science officer and founder of Lanzatech, and Gary Rieschel, founding managing partner of Qiming Venture Partners and our new Asia Society Northern California chair, also our moderator today. We have over 125 people joining us today. This is a hybrid event, so we have live audiences both here in the room at the Computer History Museum in Silicon Valley and a virtual audience with our 13 centers around the world. The advantage of being in the room today is you're going to be able to interact directly with the speakers, and we are going to be serving wine afterwards. So everyone that's in the virtual audience, please join us in person next time. Welcome to our trustees, our advisory board members, our groundbreaker members, and our innovator members. Welcome also to our series sponsors, NEA, Magdalene Yum, and Lisa Berry. Thank you. I'm Margaret Conley, the executive director of our Northern California Center. Our format for today, I'm going to introduce our speakers very shortly here. Gary is going to moderate the discussion. They will open up the room to audience Q&A. If you have a question when the time comes, and we really do want to hear from you, simply raise your hand. When you are called on, Gary will call on you. They'll bring a microphone over to you, and please introduce yourself before you ask your question. We have an hour and 15 minutes for this program. We're going to end at 5:15 Pacific. We are on the record, and we are recording. And now a few words about our speakers. K.R. Sridhar is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Bloom Energy. Before that, he was director of the Space Technologies Lab at the University of Arizona, where he worked, where the team worked on Mars exploration. K.R. has served as an advisor to NASA, and he was recognized by Fortune magazine as one of the top 5 futurists inventing tomorrow today. He was one of the early pioneers in green tech and serves as a strategic limited partner at Kleiner Perkins and as a special advisor to NEA. Dr. Sean Simpson is the chief science officer and founder of Lanzatech, which has successfully developed, scaled, and commercialized a novel industrial platform for the manufacture of sustainable fuels and chemicals. The company has raised over $500 million in investment and recently spun out a new company, Lanzatech, that will produce sustainable aviation fuel and diesel. He sits on startup boards in New Zealand, has published over 20 journals and 200 patents, and he's received numerous awards, including the 2014 New Zealand Innovator of the Year Award, and today he joins us from Chicago. Gary Rieschel has over 25 years of successful operating and investing experience as a senior executive entrepreneur, investor, and global business strategist. He is founding managing partner of Qiming, a firm with over $3 billion focused on early stage investments in China, and one of China's premier VC firms. He invests in healthcare and clean tech. He supports many organizations, including the Nature Conservancy, Rocky Mountain Institute, and the U.S. Olympic Foundation. He's lived in both Japan and Shanghai. He is our moderator today, and most importantly, he's our new Asia Society Northern California chair. Please join me in welcoming our special guest speakers.
Thanks, Margaret. I mean, part of the reason I took the chair position at the Asia Society for Northern California is because of Margaret. You rarely get to work with executive directors that are that talented, and so it's really been a lot of fun as we kick this off. You can tell the enthusiasm for actually being in person again. Every in-person event, we held an event this summer in Montana that had 100 people at it, and you had to take breaks from hugging because people were just so excited to actually be in person again. So we'll kick things off. First of all, who else watched Jim Kirk go into space this morning? Come on. You have got to appreciate what it's like from a kid who grew up with I used to hide under the covers at home so I could sneak. My parents thought I was asleep, sneak out, go turn on the TV again to watch Star Trek. And to watch him at 90 years old go into space, that was just cool. That was not the greatest difficulty I overcame today. The greatest difficulty was finding a free parking place on Stanford's campus. And so for the Bay Area people here, I think you'll appreciate how difficult that is. And finally, in this museum, in terms of my career, there are 3 exhibits that I'm actually part of. One is the chips that went into the first IBM PC, because I tested them for Intel. This is really dating me. I think I'm older than literally every single person in this room. Maybe not. There's a couple, maybe not. The second is a computer from Sequent Computer Systems, which was one of the first parallel processing machines. And then the third is a machine a gentleman named Rick Rashid used to create the Mach operating system at Carnegie Mellon. Mach then became Windows. It also became iOS. So 99.8% and Linux. So it's 99.8% of the operating system usage in the planet came from out of that one Carnegie Mellon lab. So it is kind of fun. We don't get to see the exhibits today, but it's interesting to be here. One of the things I'm going to talk about is the differences between invention and innovation and what both KR and Sean and their companies have been doing. And I think it's really important for us, especially as we're talking about climate change, to realize some realities. So invention is simply an idea that is founded to solve a particular problem. And it's not a quick solution. What makes an innovation or makes an invention an innovation is the iteration on that idea. And that takes literally a village, if not an entire global population. And I think that when you start to look at the timing associated with breakthrough technologies, these two have both created, their companies, Lanzatech and Bloom, have both created breakthrough technologies. And for the energy and fuel cell markets, the path to commercialization is long and tortuous. Typically, on average, for a technology in those areas, it's 27 years to commercialization. So when we think about solving issues associated with climate change, solving issues associated with repurposing carbon, something invented today, sometime in the year 2040 to 2045, is likely to actually be at commercial scale. So one of the things that I want people in this audience and people online and all of us in our collective lives to understand is don't let this idea that we have to have a perfect solution be what everyone starts to work towards. There are some very good solutions, we'll talk about a couple today, that are going to progress towards this. But if we wait for the perfect solution, number one, it doesn't exist, and number two, we're all going to suffer rather dramatically during that period of time. Innovation requires consistent iteration. And then you get to the early adopter, then you get to early majority, late majority, and laggard. Early majority is viewed as when something is finally commercial. The threshold is 1% market share. So for when people talk about something getting to commercialization, it typically has achieved 1% market share, which clearly isn't going to solve any of the problems that we're actually interested in solving in this room. Also want to talk about the role of Asia. So we're cheating a little bit today. This is not a China-specific topic. And we're not the China society, we're the Asia society. But given that innovation requires iteration, the role that Asia is going to play in the development of these technologies is quite profound. Having spent 12 years in China, one of the things that I took away was how rapidly the Chinese would take an invention. They didn't always invent it themselves. That's where you get issues on intellectual property and a variety of things. But they would iterate incessantly and very, very rapidly with high skill and low cost. And so that is what led to commercialization of a number of technologies. And Sean has some very specific examples about Lanzatech and how that's worked out over there. For new technologies, EV, solar, wind, autonomous vehicles, nuclear, and batteries are all technologies that are benefiting from the iteration that occurs in China. And so again, going back to some of the political discussions that we have, the idea that we're going to get to where we need to be without Asia without China, without the technologies in Japan, without the emerging markets in South and Southeast Asia, India, et cetera. That's just simply not going to happen. So there's this fantasy that we all can go our independent ways and have this come to pass, and that's simply not true. The Asia energy needs will account for 80% of new energy needs over the next decade. 80%. So when you look at where do you want to solve these problems, again, if you don't include Asia and it isn't a significant part of both the target and the solution, we're simply not going to get to where we need to be. The second major element that's being affected by energy use in Asia are supply chains. We're seeing that now. China winds up with power issues, and all of a sudden there are entire industries that are shut down. Apple, semiconductor shortages, part of that's driven by power issues. Apple winds up saying, well, we're going to have to cut supply of iPhones, mostly watches, but iPhones a little bit before the end of the year. You simply can't, again, overcome the supply chain dependencies without sufficient energy supply, reliable energy, and that's going to mean clean energy in the future. The other thing that Asia has are very large pools of technology talent. So the number of engineers being graduated in India, China, Southeast Asia, they're fundamental to actually the commercialization and the implementation of the technologies that we're talking about today. So those are all reasons how we tie in, Asia in particular into this discussion, not just China. A very depressing set of statistics come from the role of venture capital in clean tech. It has not been a very pretty picture over the last 21 years. So we're really fortunate. Two of the last deals we did with the SoftBank Mobius Group were Bloom and Lanzatech was one of the deals we did at Qiming. So we happened to pick two things that look like they've worked out rather well. But there's been $50 billion invested over the last 20 years in clean tech by venture capital firms. If you take out, and it's about 9,500 companies, roughly. If you take out Tesla, which people count in the clean tech world, you take out Bloom, you take out about 18 companies that went public that are in that group. Of the remaining money, 80% of it's been lost. So you're talking tens and tens of billions of dollars that's been lost in the clean tech sector through venture capital. So that has a somewhat permanent impact in terms of how you think about the investability of the sector. From 2010 to 2019, there were 32 new clean tech companies funded per year in the United States. New funding, venture capital funding. There were 1,000 e-commerce companies funded per year during the same period. So let's just say clean tech has not had the reputation of being low-hanging fruit for the last decade or more. China, the disparity was even greater if you're looking at those two areas. You have diseconomies of scale, which has been one of the issues. The venture capital community just plain got it wrong. When they saw that it was silicon doing solar cells, they assumed, well, larger cells, better geometries, costs will go down. It doesn't quite work that way for solar the way that it does for chips, integrated circuits, and so on. You looked at wind, and it turns out it also doesn't scale the same way for wind, even with larger wind turbines or more efficient rotor systems. It certainly didn't work that way for biofuels and some of the things that Sean has talked about. Basically, every time you go up 10x, you go from 10 gallons to 100 gallons, you have a different process. You go to 1,000 gallons, you get to recreate the process. You go to 1,000,000 gallons, you're recreating the process. So you have this consistent restart every time that you're scaling up the particular problem. And so one of the things that these two will talk about is how they've overcome that at their companies. So venture capital has been necessary but not sufficient. And part of it is this all requires a large support infrastructure of commercial partners. No entrepreneur wakes up in the morning saying, I want to work with the government. If you know one, send them my way. They'll probably need counseling. And by the way, Chinese entrepreneurs don't do that either. The idea that, well, the Chinese entrepreneurs, they're all in cahoots with the Chinese government. Let me disavow you of that, quite specifically. And people don't also wake up in the morning thinking that they want to work with a Fortune 10, 20, or 30 company, which is typical what their chemical and engineering and energy companies are, because it's just hard. But the reality is that the people who live in this world, that's what they have to do. And so somehow we're going to have to provide the right kind of support and encouragement, financial incentives, et cetera, to get these technologies to market more rapidly and bring those partners to bear earlier in the process. Margaret already took the intros for KR and Sean. And so I would simply add that of the companies that I've invested in over 26 years or so as a VC, definitely two of the most rewarding ones in terms of what they can do, what they've done to date, but really what with our collective support they can do in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to first KR and then later Sean.
Gary, thank you very much. Margaret, thank you for organizing this, and good afternoon, everyone here as well as online. Very nice to see you all. So what does Bloom do? Many of you may not know what Bloom does. I don't want to assume you do. So I'm going to just start with that for a second. So Bloom Energy makes these boxes. I'll get into the technology in a second. But you put them in a building like this right outside. You have a fuel coming in, whether it's natural gas, biogas, hydrogen, whatever that fuel is. It comes through the pipe, the same gas that comes to heat this building or to provide the fuel for how you cook with a gas stove. Without burning, without combustion, that energy in that gas, which is chemical energy, gets converted to electricity using a technology. No burning. And so you don't have the limits of efficiency, losses, the pollution that comes from NOx, SOx, particulates, and creating the air pollution. It requires no water, and it requires no backup generation. We all are, most of us, even in our homes, are beginning to have backup generation thanks to our PSPS and all the nonsense that happens. And reliably provides the power to that building 24/7, 365. Okay, so that's what we do. And we power from hospitals to big data centers, to shopping centers, to shopping malls, to Home Depots, to Walmarts, all the way to places where power simply cannot be lost. I was telling Gary and Sean last year, we had 99.99% availability of our fleet, entire fleet that we operated, greater than a nuclear power plant. The most available of any energy source in the world is nuclear power plants, about 90%. We're 99.99% because of the architecture we do. Why? In the future, our children and our grandchildren should go to a museum like this to see why you needed backup generation. Everything in our life runs on digital. Digital runs on electricity. God forbid one of us or our loved ones have to be in a hospital. That surgery is going to be done by a robot looking at visual systems, all AI coming in, everything digital. We are going to be in roads where cars are going to be driving autonomous, and there's going to be a data center and AI managing it, and God forbid there be a power disruption. So the concept of power disruption in the digital world should be unthinkable. How do you provide resilient, reliable power? So in 2001, I think, Gary, you and I met in 2003, 2004, around that time frame. But in 2001, we started the company. The idea was very simple. In a digital world, electricity is a human need, energy is a human need. It's not an option. It's not a luxury. And if you have to provide that in an accessible, affordable way to everybody on the planet, you cannot do that with centralized systems. Why did I come to that conclusion? This museum is a great place to talk about it, right? Because when there were only mainframe computers, the chips that Gary tested for IBM, how many IBM mainframe computers were there in the world and how many people had access? That number would not have shifted significantly by zeros had it not been for a distributed model to the whole thing. The Wintel, the PC. What happened? From the time of Alexander Graham Bell to today, 21 landline telephones. per 100 people on the planet. Within 20 years of cell phone becoming ubiquitous, 99 people out of 100, 99 cell phones for 100 people on the planet. Access, affordability, personalization, better, 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 win, 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 win. Centralized to distributed. So the simple notion that I had was, how do we make electricity distributed? And if you had to do that, the people before us weren't stupid. They didn't build these large power plants and grids because they were stupid. It was economies of scale. When you took a chemical energy, converted that to heat, converted that to mechanical, converted it to electrical, you needed a certain scale. So you needed to change that pattern. You can't shrink them all and, mommy, I shrank the power plant and put it in the backyard. That doesn't work. Okay, the science doesn't allow that. So what's the option? The option was to consider this fuel cell technology that's high temperature, very different from the fuel cells that you normally have heard of that we have worked on for the space program. This was something totally different. And since the 1950s, the invention was in companies and labs. But the first idea for this didn't come from Bloom. It was 1880. The first patent was filed on invention in 1880. And then every major corporation in the world has worked on this and could not crack the code. But when I saw it very differently. I said, can we take a page out of the computer revolution and apply that to the energy revolution? How do I make the Wintel PC like blade, an energy blade, an energy server? And what will it take? The idea is you can get high efficiency. The idea is you make copy exact millions of. And the first million will be more expensive and more clunky than the next million. Think of your cell phone, think of your laptop, think of your computer, your floppy drive to outside disk drive to now carrying it in your pocket. Is there a Moore's law-like thing associated with it? Can you continuously advance the technology? Can you make it small enough? And can you make the architecture such that one of them failing is not going to take down the entire thing? Such as in a data center, do those PC servers fail all the time? But does that stop the data center from failing? No. But if you had one mainframe computer, absolutely that's what will happen. So that's how we thought about it. So very different big idea in an industry since Edison hadn't really done any invention, so to speak, right? So what did it take? Which is what Gary asked us to address in terms of what did it. I thought it'll take probably 500 million in 10 years. It's probably, including field trials and everything, we do 2.5 billion in 20 years. Okay, to get to where we need to go. And how does that kind of number, at a time when we started the company and we were chatting about this, a very large VC fund was $350 to $400 million. Okay, and a typical fund age will be 8 to 10 years. How do you make it fit? How do you make the two things fit? Right? These are the issues. But little did we realize, why does it take that long? The difference between software, once you invent, to piloting it, to scale out. If you don't do it in weeks or months, somebody else is going to copy it before you and get it out. So that's your window. Out here, we probably have a 15-year lead on somebody else because of what we have done. This is one of those examples where 10 women cannot give birth to a baby in 1 month. Right? That's the way to think about it. So these are hard, big things. And you have to experiment. You have to try things out. And Murphy will smile at you in every possible way they can along the way. It'll break in every possible way you can imagine. And you cannot imagine, because if you had imagined it, you would have fixed it. And that happens in the field. And there is never a hardware in your life you've ever purchased new where the 2.0 is not better than the 1.0 and the 3.0 is not better. You know, think of even 20 years ago, even a very old technology like your car. Every 3,000 miles you have to go change your oil. How often do you do it today? It's constant improvement is where it needs to go. And when you're doing that, if you have a very strong incumbent, like the two of us do, that has a vested interest to keep their old business going, and your cost point is high, they'll find every way to kill you. In a free market where there is no other support structure for it. This is the reason, if you think about whether it was horse buggies to cars, whether it was airplanes, whether it was ships, it was usually a nation state for security reasons, for other reasons that went and funded it. Whereas today, we are trying to do that in a world where those nation states are run by systems on whom the incumbents have a significantly greater influence than somebody trying to do something new. So unless those nation states take a long view, and there are places in Asia where you will see that, they become a lot more conducive for these kind of technologies to be tested, tried out, worked out, compared to when it is convenient, we say, let the free market take care of it. When it's not, we say it the other way around. Right? So those are challenges. Policies. Policies always catch up to technology moving forward. Technology moves a lot faster, policy catches up. But in an infrastructure like energy, you can't go play rogue. I can't just come and install an electric system out here, we'll go to jail. Whereas in other things you could. The two or three areas you cannot are, thank God, for pharmaceuticals and drugs and things like that, for energy, for infrastructure, because they are the right thing to do. There needs to be policy, otherwise think of safety. But how does that whole entire policy innovation, there is no policy entrepreneurship that's catching up with infrastructure entrepreneurship. So you see that gap, right? That's the other challenge that you have. So if all these issues, and I can go on for a while, but I want to pass it on. So if you put these kind of obstacles, and if you have to be successful, you have to somehow navigate and overcome all those things. I can tell you the nuances of policy making, bill making, foreign policy, things that I had to learn that I never expected as a scientist, engineer, I would have to learn along the way. Without that, we can't build a company. And if all those risks exist in addition to execution risk on your technology, how does a VC fund it and make money? So these are the things that have to change, right? And this is what has made it hard in the past. However, without that innovation coming from small entrepreneurial companies around the world, we are not going to solve these big problems facing humanity, such as climate change. So the change that is needed is not in young people who really want to do this. I can tell you, recruiting young people for these kind of missions, that talent, we can recruit them because they're missionaries. They believe in the mission. They really want to come. That's not a problem. Ideas, that's not a problem. How is society going to adopt it? How is society going to change to adopt it? Because without that adaptation, like you said, of technologies that are there today that can impact in the next few years, it's a nice shiny object out there. It'll be beautiful for all of us if just solar, wind, batteries, and hydrogen took care of our power needs. That may happen 30 years from now, not between now and the next 30 years. How do we mitigate carbon along the way with what we know? Those are the hard questions we have to answer and figure out ways.
So just real quick as a follow-up, what's your current capacity? What are you installing every year?
So we
now?
have equivalent of about a nuclear power plant worth of capacity. And when we talk gigawatts, right, it is 24/7 always on. Whereas, to give you an example, when you say you're installing a gigawatt of solar, think about 30% capacity factor because the sun doesn't shine all the time. And then think about the transmission distribution losses that come from where you are and where you need it. And many times that solar power will be curtailed because when the sun is shining, there's too much power at a time of the day that all of us don't need the power. So you'll curtail it. So you put all that together, it's probably in the teens in total usage. Whereas when we say 100% of what we produce, there is no loss going straight from what we do to the building. So the total impact of what we do is pretty enormous even with that size. And within the next 2 years, we will probably double or quadruple our capacity.
So you're installing effectively a new nuclear reactor every year with your technology.
That's and more is the hope.
Very cool. Sean?
Thanks, Gary. And thanks, KR. I mean, I don't think I've heard that story, so I was listening intently. And thanks, Margaret, for organising this event. Fantastic. So I'll start by introducing Lanzatech and what we do. And when people talk about the climate crisis, the deepening climate crisis, and how that has led to the need for an energy transition, really what people are talking about is a feedstock transition away from resources we dig out of the ground to resources that we need to find above the ground. And Lanzatech started really thinking about that, really thinking about sustainable fuels, sustainable chemicals. And at the time we were thinking about it, everybody was thinking wood. Wood was going to replace 100 million barrels a day of oil. And when you say it like that, you realize how stupid that is. Because one, wood's super valuable, it's super expensive, and it's super difficult to turn into all the things that we see in this room, outside of the wood. If we look in this room, we see that the chair is pretty much entirely made from a barrel of oil. 50% of our clothing is made from a barrel of oil. The stuff coating the walls is a barrel of oil. It's everywhere. Oil is everywhere, and all of that is carbon. Carbon that we need to replace from a sustainable source. So that's where we started. We started thinking about how we were going to find sources of low-cost carbon that we convert into fuels and chemicals. And I'm a biologist, so inherently I started thinking about a biological process, and it turns out that the first life on Earth were organisms that used carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen as sources of energy and carbon to perpetuate themselves and make products. So this is now, 4 billion years ago. And that biochemistry is still on Earth today. We still have organisms that use these gases they don't use sugars, they use gases as their sole source of carbon energy. And so our idea was to industrialize that biochemistry in order to give us access to waste streams from industry, so carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen, waste streams from society, so you can take municipal solid waste, trash, you can turn it into a gas, you can process that. Waste streams from agriculture, you can do the same transformation. But also CO2 itself, the very cause of our climate crisis, can be taken and combined with renewable hydrogen and turned into products. And it's that process that we sought to commercialize in 2005. Now, the problem is that we had nothing to point to and said, well, we're going to be like that. Yeah, there was no equivalent process. If you were at that time you were developing a sugar-based fermentation process, like most clean tech companies at the time, you had industries on several continents you could point to, and everybody could say, well, we're going to be kind of like that, but a little bit different using trees. We didn't have that. So we've had to demonstrate every aspect of this process from the ground up, from the beginning, without ever assuming that the scalability or the operability of this process at scale could be taken for granted. We could never assume that. People scaling a sugar process could assume that. It turns out that was their downfall. Our journey started with the most awful experience possible for a biologist, and that's having to hire an engineer. And I mean, as a biologist, I'm going to work on this bacteria. It's going to do its thing. We're going to scale it up. We're going to do what it does there. It's going to be just a lot bigger. And what could possibly go wrong with that? That's obvious. You ask an engineer about this, they're asking you all sorts of hard questions about what's the exotherm of this process, what's the longevity of this reaction, how much gas do you need per unit microbe to produce this amount of product. And so, but it turns out that was entirely necessary. Gary made the point, it takes a village. We were dragged kicking and screaming into that village of talent that you need to put together to scale an industry. And that's what we've done. We've scaled an industry. You bring together biology, you bring together engineering, every discipline of engineering, you bring together sophisticated synthetic biologists and then computational biologists, and then you've got a chance to conceptualize and then to begin to scale a process. So, people, yes. Intent. Our intention was to convert resources that had never been converted by biology into sustainable fuels and chemicals. No one believed that one could take a biological process, place it at a steel mill, and produce a sustainable fuels. No one had ever done it. And if you went to a steel maker at the time, they would have told you that, quite frankly, they didn't want your filthy microbes at their nice steel mill because they weren't sure that was allowed under the health and safety policy. So we went to a steel mill and we got permission to build our first pilot plant. We started the company in 2005. At that time, the reaction of gas via microbe to ethanol was something that happened in a test tube. 2005, 2008, we were operating our first pilot plant at a steel mill in New Zealand where we started the company. That pilot plant became the greatest marketing tool that we had because we had a physical demonstration to the very people who we wanted to appeal to at that time, steel makers, of how this thing worked. Now think about that time, 2008. That was the year that the bankers of the world decided that we didn't really need money, but we did, and we were faced with this challenge. How do we fund the company? There's no liquidity anywhere that we would normally go to raise money. But actually, the place we needed to go was China. We needed to go to China. Why? Because 80% of world steel is made in China. And China didn't have a financial crisis. In fact, China was spending money like it was going out of fashion. Went to China, met Gary, but more importantly, actually, we were able to strike deals with Chinese steelmakers to get to the next scale of our technology. Again, a process that had never been achieved before. No one had ever scaled a process that would turn gases into sustainable products biologically. In China, they wanted to see it operating in China. If you'd asked anyone at that time, your startup company is going to go and demonstrate its brand new, highly proprietary technology in China, do you think we should do this? Everyone would have said no. Every single person would say no. In fact, outside of Gary, who just invested in the company, everyone else was saying no in our investment group. But it was the smartest thing we ever did Because without that step, without that demonstration scale at a real-world steel mill at a reasonable scale in China, we would never have got to commercial. No one would ever have gone from that pilot to a full-scale unit. We went to China. We operated taking live feeds of steel mill gas from a steel mill in China. In fact, we did it twice with the two biggest steel makers in China at the time, and showed that we can not only take our process and operate it, continuously, but take our process out of New Zealand, start commercializing around the world. And that became the inflection point for our company. Nowhere else in the world would that have been possible. Today, we operate two fully commercial plants in China. We produce 100,000 tons of ethanol from steel industry waste gases. We're in construction with plants around the world right now, one in Europe, two in India, one in Japan, many more deals on the way. Each one of those deals represents a slightly different source of above-ground carbon. We're working with municipal solid waste, so trash, converting that into sustainable fuels and chemicals. We're working with agricultural residues, turning those into fuels and chemicals. Our next big endeavor is to work with renewable hydrogen, so hydrogen produced via water electrolysis, together with concentrated CO2, turn that into fuels and chemicals. We developed a process to produce jet fuel. We spun that out as a separate company. To reiterate some of the points that KR made, I thought that the commercializing a biological sustainable fuel and chemical process that no one had ever envisaged before the time of Lanzatech's founding would be the challenge. It turns out policy is the challenge. Can you imagine, in the US today, we have a policy for biofuels. It's not really a policy for biofuels. It's a policy that encourages the production of fuels from plants. It doesn't encourage the reduction of CO2. It encourages the production of fuels from plants. It doesn't encourage the use of the gases that come from the steel mills in Indiana and produce a fuel from that. In fact, that's specifically outlawed in this policy. It's not acceptable here. We can't commercialize that here. And so the difficulty with policy today is that policy makers have legislated the how, not the why. Yes, not the outcome. They haven't legislated what we want to do is produce CO2. They've legislated, we want you to make something from a tree, which is possibly the most anti-innovation thing I can imagine. Yeah, you've taken the role of the entrepreneur and tried with your crystal ball to focus them on what you think the future will hold. Now, man's ability to predict the future is historically been awful. We've never been good at it. We're not good at it. We're good at finding innovative solutions to problems. Set a problem. Set a goal. And innovation can achieve that goal. And I think that the journey of Lanzatech has been one, again, as KR said, of trying to find the friends we can, find the places we can go in order to commercialize the technology, demonstrate its worth, in order then, retrospectively, to have policies adapted to enable us to exist.
So just one thing for Sean, but it's KR's story of how he came to create what was Start Ion America, which then became Bloom, was he was working on how would you live on Mars and what would the process, so Elon has nothing on KR. But KR was working on what would the chemical processes be to generate water and generate fuel to live on Mars. Sean, you were driving by a steel mill. You were working with a bacteria that lives in chicken shit. How did you think about steel gas through a bacteria? So I understand KR's leap. can't get yours?
Well, it's just asking really obvious questions about what you see around. I mean, so you see a big flare above a steel mill, and if you basically know something about science, you know that there's got to be some energy in that gas because someone's just set it on fire. And so, what is that? What was why set that on fire? And why, if that's something we can do, could we just take that and turn it into something else? And the fact that today every primary steel mill in the world produces high concentrated streams of carbon monoxide that all ends up as carbon dioxide today, why not harness that in the first instance? You could produce twice as much ethanol from waste gases from the steel industry alone than is produced from the fermentation of sugar in Brazil and corn in the US combined. Twice as much. Over 50 billion gallons could be produced just from the waste streams from steel making. We're not talking about CO2 from the atmosphere and green hydrogen. We're not talking about the trash. We're not talking about waste from agriculture, just from the steel industry. So the resources we have available to us are vast. The technologies are available.
So KR, when you look at where Bloom is today and you give us a snapshot, 5 years from now, where's Bloom? Where's the technology? I mean, the policy side will be the policy side. We hopefully will have influence on that, but we're not sure. But in terms of people in this room thinking about where will this technology ultimately get to, and Sean, I'll have the same question for you. You may want to talk about some of the clothing or something we might be wearing of Lanzatech products in the very short term. But for Bloom, where does this go? Give us a 5-year glimpse, knowing that you're a public company and you have to be careful. But
so let me paint a 10-year vision for that exact reason. I know where we want to be in 5, but that's too close to comfort in a material way. So 10 years from now, look, it is inevitable that most of the growth going forward will be in a distributed fashion where people have leapfrogged. The beauty of the only advantage of being an underdeveloped country and energy poor is that you don't have it. You don't need to make the mistakes of the past. You can just go straight to what is beautiful. Simple example again, here on 280, most of you live in the Bay Area, our cell phone sucks. You go to India, you go to China, you never drop a call. Okay, because it was all built from scratch for that as opposed to piecing it together, right? So the same thing is going to happen. And why has that not happened? The truth is something that environmentalists and energy entrepreneurs and energy people will not admit. But the reality is, we didn't have to go force people to buy a cell phone. We didn't have to ask kids to get out of class and go hold banners saying ban landline telephones. It happened because it was a better solution. It happened because it was the right economic solution. It also happened because it's the right thing to do. So clean energy simply means, let's go back to a very great example that Sean painted out there. When something is burning out there, you're throwing away money. That's useful energy, right? If you're able to optimize for the lowest cost solution by taking everything and making it happen, inherently it is going to be clean. Inherently it's going to be more efficient. We just need the runway to be able to get there because technology works that way. Within 10 years, we're going to make it happen. This is not about policy. You cannot stop. You can only stop truth from playing out for so long, no matter what it is, what policies there are. It is going to happen because it is going to be the better solution that also happen better for the wallet, but it also happens to be better for the environment, not the other way around.
it has to be wallet first.
It has to be wallet first. And here's a simple reason, right? You all think of electricity and you just simply think solar, wind, batteries, because that's the narrative in the press. Carbon, as Sean very clearly pointed out to you, is everywhere in everything we do. Energy is used in so many different ways for so many different reasons, everything having a carbon footprint into one atmosphere. There is no Chinese atmosphere, US atmosphere. There is one atmosphere on the planet, right? It all goes there. So in that energy, today, as of 2019 is the latest data for Globe. I don't have it for 2021. But as of 2019, 0.49% of the world's energy is solar. 0.49%. 0.97% is wind. Rest of it, other than nuclear and hydro, which haven't grown, all have a carbon footprint. If we don't adopt the technologies like what Sean's doing, what we're trying to do, to capture that carbon, use it, do what you need to do, we're not going to solve the climate crisis. So it is about aggressively growing solar and wind, but it's also about aggressively cutting the carbon with everything else we do.
Sean?
So we can make ethanol from waste from industry, waste from society, waste from agriculture, and CO2. We can make ethanol. Ethanol is a 2-carbon alcohol. Ethanol is a great platform. You've got enough of it, you can now think about making ethanol, goes to ethylene, the olefin. Ethylene, one of the largest commodities on Earth, go into the ethylene value chain. Today, we're already showing that we can convert the ethanol that we produce into a spectrum of materials, clothing, so fibers, plastics, bottles, as well as chemicals like surfactants used in laundry detergent. We can convert it into jet fuel. So we can already use ethanol, the product that we can make from all of these waste streams that are above ground, carbon captured, and turn it into these molecules. And people want them. Why? Because people have started to understand that the climate crisis is about CO2 and capturing CO2 and fixing it into stuff, and therefore displacing that stuff that's today made from oil is helping, is a good thing, is a way for them to take control, to take responsibility, to do something. We produce a plastic bottle. The weight of that plastic bottle reflects the amount of carbon we've taken out of the atmosphere. That's attractive. People get it. Today, we've done a deal with Lululemon to produce yoga pants. You thought, I didn't think I'd be saying that. From captured carbon.
You're not the model, by the way.
Of course I am. I mean, so it's the first thing that we negotiated on. But so we produce yoga pants from, or sports apparel, I think is the word I should use, but from captured carbon from a steel mill in China. We've produced laundry detergent from captured carbon from a steel industry in China. Plastic bottles, supermarket, household cleaners. All of this stuff we're already showing these materials, these goods can be made from captured carbon, and people want them. People are prepared to buy them. People are excited by them. It increases market share. L'Oreal wants to bottle their beauty care products in a plastic bottle made from captured carbon from a steel mill in China. Imagine that. The people get it to such a degree that the source is attractive. Who ever thought that the emission from a steel mill would be attractive to someone who's environmentally conscious buying a L'Oreal beauty care product? But that's where we're at. And so where are we going to be in 5 to 10 years? We're going to be bringing these products made not just from ethanol, but using synthetic biology. We can make other exciting chemicals directly from these gases to market, such that our car headlamps are all made from captured carbon. Every plastic item can be made from captured carbon. We're demonstrating that this is possible. Energy transition is possible. Alternative sources of the carbon that we need is possible.
So real quick, a number, so very brief. How many patents during the course of your history to date for both Bloom and Lanzatech have you guys been able to file and receive.
Between awarded and what's been applied and being processed, a little over 500 patents.
We've been granted 1,000 patents. In fact, Lanzatech is as much a patent play as it is anything else, because if you take the view that using these above-ground carbon resources is the future, then we represent one of the few technologies enabling that transition.
In case anyone thought that what they've done is easy, just to kind of put it. I know of no other, I mean, the only startups that even come close to that are in the semiconductor industry, and that's only people that do a lot of design work. And so this is quite remarkable.
Gary, I can already see the commercial that, when you asked him if he was going to be the model, based on the question you asked, Sean. I can see you in New Zealand with your Lululemon yoga pants jumping out of chicken shit straight into the steel.
The Kiwis would go for that in a big way. By the way, this is also this panel is also
audience.
A great advertisement for a very liberal, IQ-focused immigration policy. So questions from the audience, we'll take a couple. So I was told to go to this side of the room. Okay, you got first. Say your name when you... and then you're next. No, you can. No, we just want the back of your head. We're good.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Chucking. I'm actually also affiliated with Asia 21, also president of the Asia Society Young Leaders Group. So for those of you guys who want to participate, we'd love to also have that. I'm also the head of actually Berkeley's International Alumni Association. So this week's been great because Berkeley has 4 Nobel Prize winners, and also Stanford has 1. But yeah, just kidding. Well, my question, really is, hey, Gary, thanks so much for sharing those stats. And I think that actually Mark Tarping, co-founder of Tesla, is a good friend of mine. So I think he's very happy that every time when Tesla is mentioned, I'm sure he's very pleased about that. My question to actually KR as well as Sean it's really, KR, I love what you said, which is like basically the ozone layer of the atmosphere doesn't belong to China or the US for that matter. It's really global. Everybody has a responsibility. And I think, Sean, you mentioned about how you've actually have, the test case, if you will, went to China and actually proven, that the technology worked. So my question to you guys, especially in the area of really, like environment, this is something that everybody needs to step up. So my question is, how do we actually, given the challenges we're facing right now between US and China, these are 2 largest polluters. So how do we actually move things forward, at least move a step forward, despite the challenges we're facing?
So my view on this, again, this is just a human view, right? It's not an entrepreneur's view, but is basically when 2 parties get together and try to negotiate, if you start with what is of common interest, that's the only way you can make progress, because if you start talking about the things that you disagree with to start with, that goes nowhere in a negotiation. Find the common ground, then try to move that boundary further and further. That's the only way. Talking to, I have a ex-Secretary of State, Colin Powell, on my board, so we talk about these issues a lot, and that's the only way to move the ball forward. Climate is probably one of the few things we can agree upon for the obvious reason, right? And so I think sooner or later, it is in the interest of both countries to do it. But more importantly, I don't think the world is going to get to anything practical unless these 2 nations agree upon it, period. So it is incumbent on the rest of the world to force these 2 countries to work together on climate.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, ultimately, the unifier here is climate. And climate is, and we were talking about this earlier, the climate crisis is going to be felt at a national security level, in my view, before it's going to be felt at a household level. Yeah. So each nation, every nation, it has to be committed to resolving this for the globe, for national security. So it's a selfish, global kind of driver that we all need to be aware of. And so, to me, this is the unifier. This is the topic that needs to be to be under discussion. This is what every nation has in common, and no more so than China and the US for the reasons that you clearly articulate. Yeah.
All right. Third row, right behind you. Is there a microphone?
Thank you. So I so happen to be one of those government audiences, and I was shocked about...
So what's your name?
Oh, my name is Jordan Sun. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for the City of San Jose. I work for Mayor Sam Liccardo, and I lead the Mayor's Office of Tech Innovation. I also wear the Army hat as a squadron commander for technology scouting for the Army here in the Bay Area. And so, I'm surprised policy came up so much in this conversation. I'm very curious, for y'all as founders and entrepreneurs, specifically, which country would you want to talk to, first of all, if you had an audience to say anything you want about do or don't, which office and at what level? And I'm curious, what keeps you up at night, and what would you tell this leader to do something or to not do something, and it would be wished and granted to you?
That's a very good question. So let me take a crack at this. So if I were king for the day, or if I had one wish, what would I want from a policy perspective is how I would translate your question, right? So I am convinced we would not be carrying a smartphone with us, but for a policy action that happened in the 80s. And that's called the Telecom Act. This was MCI struggling to get into the same lines as AT&T, and AT&T being a monopoly, not allowing them to happen. And, you're probably not old enough to remember peak rates versus non-peak rates versus, it costs you, if you call between 8 and 5, you have to pay a different rate, another rate, blah, 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 right? And interstate, no roaming, balkanized everything. Without the Telecom Act coming and opening up that entire space, entrepreneurs would not have got in, because there was no way to monetize innovation in that area. Number one. Number two, VCs wouldn't have come and put the money in because there was no way to innovate. You're going to sell to one single player. That, in hindsight, from a policy perspective, and it got it right. Sean kept talking about this. This is what we call policymakers, forget alone innovators. Even the only way you can predict where the future is going to be if you innovate and you get it right. If you innovate, you may not get it right. If you innovate and get it right is the only way you invent the future, right? So policymakers by no way can divine what to support. So it is the what, not who or how, technology neutral. Luckily, the Telecom Act got written that way. Because otherwise, who in their right mind would have thought that there's ever going to be a mobile phone going that way and it's going to have all this stuff? No policy stood in the way, which is why it spread the way it did. So if I had a wish, it would be give us the Energy Act, similar to the Telecom Act, that creates a level playing field. We're not asking for unfair treatment. Create a level playing field, because technology will win.
Sean?
So you asked very specifically which country and who. It almost doesn't matter which country, but let's say this country, and who. If I could be king for a day, it would be to say there is no such thing as waste. We cannot have it. We cannot have waste. We have to have solutions for waste streams. It's and again, this is it's very naive to a degree to say this, but we have to now transition to a point where the outcomes of the things we do don't create a problem for this generation, the generation after, and then 6 generations beyond, from the perspective of the climate. Yeah, and that's been acceptable for the last 100 years. The next 100 years It cannot be acceptable. So we have to decide that there's no such thing as waste. And once we make that choice and we choose to have no waste, we can drive around in a car, there's no waste. We make the stuff we need to make, but there's no waste. We treat everything as a resource, and we incent that. Then we'll be on a track to really change things.
So I'm going to add two of my own. One is of carbon tax. So start with $40 per metric ton, and put that out there, because I've never known anyone who changes their behavior unless there was financial inconvenience associated with it. And then the second thing is give me one of the $7 trillion you talk about spending in Congress and electrify Africa. Because if you really want to change behavior there, once they have electricity, they have education. Once you have education, then you can have a conversation about climate change and about behavior modification on that emerging continent. Okay, next question. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go over this side.
Hi, it's Slav Hermanovich from UC Berkeley and Tsinghua Berkeley Shenzhen Institute. Two words are looming over all this discussion. That's industrial policy. But in that context, how do you see financing mechanism for this? You all alluded or clearly said that VC does not work for this type of solution. So essentially, where is the money going to come from?
I think that was a problem for us when we were doing this. Today, with ESG, with what's going on, if anything, the market is flooded with infrastructure funds. It will only get flooded even more, provided they have certainty of policy. Again, it goes back to, I think there's plenty of money to go around. Again, you're the expert in this, you should speak to it. But what I'm seeing is the people knocking at the door saying, we would like to fund more things. What are those great ideas out there? So the money is there, but they're not certain to put that money to play until there's certainty of policy.
Yeah, there really is money there. There really is a demand for these technologies, but there is a marketplace uncertainty that's got to be overcome. No doubt. But I do think there's a lot of lessons that certainly our industry can learn, for example, from the wind industry as to how they organize themselves and they started funding large-scale projects with innovative financial strategies.
I mean, these two companies together have raised $3 billion. That's a mediocre fintech company today. I am going to cast aspersions at the mentality of the venture capital community, because it's the lemming mentality really drives me crazy sometimes. But when I look at the amount of money that's available in the marketplace, to KR's point, Sean, if there was an energy policy that said it's simply the economics, and we're going to, the distribution issues, everything else, if it's just the economics, if we didn't have $250 billion a year going to agricultural subsidies, Lanzatech wouldn't be having a problem with corn ethanol as a major competitor to its solution. So stop the nonsense. There's plenty of money. You're next. We have time for just a couple more questions. I'll try to get 3 in. So,
Hugh Lester from PwC. I was curious as to what technologies coming out of Asia, or innovations out of Asia, you admire and why.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming out of Asia, I think you're seeing in the field that I understand, synthetic biology is going to become a huge movement out of Asia. In the US, we tend to focus, look at ginkgo, look at Zymogen. There's a ginkgo and a Zymogen being built every couple of months at the moment in China, and no one understands the scale of innovation that's going to come through that level of focus on synthetic biology in Asia. I think that particularly solar technologies coming out of Asia, so solar deployments, that's something that I think is now going to be transformational already in a time frame that's relevant to us. So those are the two things that I really see at the moment.
So one comment would be, again, what's coming out of Asia is innovation, not necessarily invention, but the way that the iteration cycle is going to occur. They're going to come down the learning curve in terms of price and cost much more dramatically than anyone's happening in the West. I think when Sean and I were talking earlier with KR, it was the contract for the first Lanzatech plant was actually signed in Europe. The contract for the Chinese operation was signed later the same year. The Chinese operation's been in business for 3 years. The European operation will hopefully start business next year. That's just the way it is. So, yeah.
Kenny Shen. Yeah, I was wondering about state initiatives, and this is part of the industrial policy and what's coming out of China. And I was reading about the innovation itinerations in thorium as a nuclear alternative. So I was wondering, Gary, is there something to that? And as being a scientist, KR, thorium, nuclear reactors. And I know that's a kind of a innovative approach in itineration, and they've been working on it. And I've been reading the internet on how they're actually beginning to commercialize this for the Belt and Road. So I wondered your comments about such a program.
So again, even if you talk to the people who have funded the small nuclear, there's so much innovation going on. There are even some fusion reactor startups that have been funded, and they're making progress. I think Gary's point when he talked about invention to innovation to scale applies here. We should be funding all of them because there's a short-term, mid-term, long-term. We never know what ultimately is going to scale and what the winners will be. We need every single idea we can. The world needs, so the concept that we need to understand is there is two things that people sometimes mistake. No waste. You just heard Sean give a thesis for that. Absolutely correct. But let's curtail does not exist in my vocabulary. I'm an abundance guy. The world needs abundance of energy. It should not be wasted because energy is what creates economic growth. It creates well-being. We need more energy, not less, but it shouldn't be wasted. It should not come at the cost of sustainability, right? So we need all these ideas. But any of these ideas, like a new idea on thorium, coming into market, making an impact, maybe 20 to 25 years from now, optimistically, right? So we should be funding it, but don't count on it to make a difference in your backyard 5 years from now.
Okay, last question.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm an entrepreneur in the cloud and global supply chain space. The question directed to KR, I was very impressed how the way you talk about we have gone through 20 years, right? Could you share more personal, how did you develop from academia into executive to really imbue that long-term vision into a practical matter to create something? I'm very curious about it.
So when I was in academia, like Gary said, what I was working on was Mars missions and how to live off the land, be a true explorer, burn your boat, live where you live, right? So why was I thinking that? Earth is our cradle, it's our crib. We are still little kids. Someday we have to grow up and go other places. Okay, the long view of the world, hopefully, right? That's the way you think. So the reason I was doing that was impact. The reason I started Bloom is not I had an entrepreneurial itch, it was impact. It was the world needs three things: clean energy, clean water, clean air. And energy becomes very important to get the other things going and doing it right and making it affordable. So that's how I thought about it. And everything else along the way was how an entrepreneur like us think. Sean explained about the biologist learning to talk engineering speak. I had to learn the political speak, policy speak, financial speak, all that stuff, because that's what's necessary to take your mission and go where you need to go. We're going to learn whatever it takes and overcome whatever obstacle it takes to get to the other side.
So I want to thank both of you, Sean from flying out from Chicago for this, and KR from driving down from Woodside. But it's been certainly one of the most rewarding experiences in my venture career to have been involved in both these companies. And so I want to thank you very much for participating today. Thank all of you for coming out and joining our first hybrid, truly back in person Asia Society event. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
I don't need that one, but yes, thanks to KR, Sean, and Gary. We appreciate you giving us a glimpse of the future. Impressive that we have 1,500 patents sitting up here. And we look forward to seeing KR's marketing vision for Sean. For those that are here in the room, we are hosting a networking reception. We have wine in the back and we have cheese boxes for everybody outside. Thanks to our virtual audience. Thank you again to our sponsors, NEA, Magdalene Yum, and Lisa Berry. We have a number of upcoming events. Mark your calendars, October 13th. We're going to talk about Japan's new Prime Minister with Jesper Kohl and James Higa. October 25th, we have Hong Kong's Secretary for the Environment coming to join us. Get your early bird tickets now for our Future of U.S.-China conference going to be held right here on January 13th. Our CEO, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, is going to be joining us for that one. And you can check out our website for all of our programs. I'd like to recognize our team. Can you guys raise your hands? We have Rexel Uy, Angela Chung, James Gale, and Michael Chong. Thank you to our volunteers and interns, and from all of us at the Northern California Center, we'll see you again in person soon.